Welcome back. Now, Aspen says Africa's initiatives to increase autonomy in the healthcare sector is gaining steam. That's as the continent looks to reduce its dependence on foreign companies that supply about 80% of the drugs and 99% of the vaccines used in the region. And joining me now with greater detail on this is the Senior Executive for Strategic Trade at Aspen, Stavros Nicolaou. Thank you so much for your time, Stavros. We always make reference to COVID-19 and obviously some of the inroads that we have made since then. Where is Africa in terms of the journey to vaccine autonomy?
Firstly, thanks very much for having me again. And I'm calling you out of Cairo today. Cairo is the host city for the African Health Excon, as it's called. It's hosted by none other than the President of Egypt, President Al-Sisi. So that, I think, demonstrates the importance and relevance that Egypt is placing on healthcare, but particularly this conference is focused on localization on the African continent. We've been discussing this matter for some time now, but it's always good to try and see from time to time iteratively where we are and what sort of progress has been made. So I think what I'm taking out of the conversations I've had in the last 48 hours, including the health minister of Egypt, is some stock taking. Where is the continent actually? And then what are the areas that still need to be addressed in order to give real momentum and acceleration to this localization initiative? And that's what I'm going to sort of cover in your question. So the first thing is that in order to execute on the African vaccine and pharmaceutical plan, we needed to reorientate or reconfigure the international procurement agencies, the way they procure medicines, because as you correctly pointed out at the outset, Africa imports most of its medicines. So 99% of our vaccines are imported, and anything from 80 to 90% of our pharmaceuticals are imported. But what struck me is how progressive Egypt is in pursuit of this objective, to the extent that 91% of what can be produced in Egypt, pharmaceutically speaking, not everything can, of course, but 91% is actually produced here. So they've made some big inroads. And I think there's a message there as well for South Africa and the rest of the continent, is that we might be leading at the moment as South Africa, but we also need to work with all our regulators back home and the various institutions and agencies so that we don't get caught left behind here either. So that's the one take home. The second take home is, how have we progressed with this reorientation of international procurement? And I think since we last spoke, which was a few months back, if I remember, there have been two developments. The first is Gavi. Gavi is the Global Alliance for Vaccine Initiative, which procures around 60% of Africa's vaccine requirements. They are going to be making an announcement in Paris on the 20th of June in 2 weeks' time. And that announcement will be a mechanism called the Africa Vaccine Manufacturers Accelerator. And what that will do is it's a financial package for African producers who want to produce and export vaccines into the rest of the continent. So that's an eagerly awaited announcement on the 20th of June. Will that solve all the problems? It certainly won't, but it's a step in the right direction. And I think probably a little more encouraging is PEPFAR, which is the President's Emergency Relief Fund for AIDS, and it falls under this current US president, at the moment President Biden. They are the biggest procurers of antiretrovirals on the continent. As you know, the continent has the highest HIV population of any continent. About almost 70% of the world's HIV infection rate finds itself in Africa. And PEPFAR sent a very strong signal as recently as 3 weeks ago to say that what they are going to do is they're going to make 15 to 20% of their funding for ARVs available to African producers for procurement of African antiretrovirals for Africa. And those are two encouraging developments. They're not going to solve every single problem. There's a long road still to go, but these are important milestones to celebrate when they happen. Just the last comment I do want to make is that aligning procurement policy with regulatory policy in all of these things is critical. And it would seem that regulatory policy, and here I'm referring to the World Health Organization's pre-qualification process, is lagging behind the procurement initiatives, and we need the two to catch up here. So that's got to be sort of the next area we tackle as governments on the continent and as pharmaceutical industry on the continent. I think we need to jointly tackle the WHO pre-qualification. It is somewhat out of step, in my opinion, with the procurement policies.
Well, you can make vaccines, but does the uptake actually match up to that?
So look, we know that for certain products in therapeutic categories, there is an active demand on the continent. I think what's interesting is that Africa is around 17% odd of the world's population. We're a population of 1.3 billion out of a population of 8.5 billion. So I hope my maths stacks up there. But we certainly have around 16-17%. And we carry 25% of the world's health burden. So there is demand, and I think we know what those disease entities and or patterns are. We know that we've got a high HIV demand. Vaccines, the continent consumes 1.2 to 1.3 billion doses of vaccines, mainly pediatric vaccines annually. And then, of course, for me, the most sinister pandemic that has emerged and sort of crept out of nowhere and taken everyone by surprise is something like diabetes. So these non-communicable diseases, we always saw Africa as a continent that's characterized by these infectious diseases, and some people call them third world diseases. And kind of that was the picture one assumed for Africa. But however, the reality is that non-communicable diseases, things like diabetes in particular, cardiovascular disease, have really crept up and grown on the continent. And the problem with diabetes is that you only really discover, unless you've got good diagnostics, you only really discover that you've got a problem quite late in the progression of the disease, which means people are losing their sight, they're having their limbs amputated, they're going into renal failure. There are many complications of diabetes. And what's really sad for me is the demand is there, but it's an undiagnosed demand. And what's very sad, I was going to say, is that very few people that need insulin on our continent can actually access insulin. And that is why Aspen recently announced a deal with Novo Nordisk, who is the largest producer globally, and the inceptors of insulin over 100 years ago, that were first to bring an insulin product to market. That is why we announced this contract manufacturing deal, because jointly we would like to address the insulin access on the continent and give people hope and opportunity to survive longer with diabetes. I mean, there are all sorts of bad statistics, like, you can take 39 years off a person's life if they've got an uncontrolled type 1 diabetes. I mean, these are statistics that we've got to start challenging and confronting on the continent.
All right. Well, we do have to wrap up the conversation there, Stavros. Thank you so much for giving us insight on some of the key things that have come out of the African Health Excon there in Cairo. Till we talk again on the developments on that as we head to vaccine autonomy in Africa. That was Stavros Nicolaou from Aspen.